Hello everybody, hope you're doing well. Tonight's presentation is going to be on the thorny and controversial subject of illegal immigration. I feel impelled to do one on illegal immigration given the fact that politicians in Washington have been constantly making the assertion that Hispanics are in favor of illegal immigration. A lot of ink has been spilled on this subject, so I thought that these politicians in Washington might benefit from the insights of an actual Hispanic. My ancestors weren't from Mexico or Central America, so, I'm kind of outside that traditional cultural zone, but having a Spanish surname, it's pants now. It was originally Pantalones, Señor Pantalones, 4 generations back. But I do have a Spanish surname, and that being the fact, I thought it entitled me to pontificate somewhat on this subject. So let's begin. Illegal immigration. It was touched off in the most part by the North American Free Trade Agreement back in the 1990s. For those who don't remember or are too young to know, NAFTA, as it was called, opened up trade barriers. Formerly, Mexico had tariffs protecting their farmers. After NAFTA, large agribusinesses like Monsanto and Cargill dumped billions of metric tons of cheap corn onto the Mexican market. This had devastating consequences to the small family-run farms. The largely agrarian population lost their livelihood, and the jobs that did remain in Mexico were largely slashed wage-wise, to the point where Mexico now has a lower hourly wage than communist China. This set off mass immigration of Mexicans to the northern border to get jobs, and it was an exodus largely abetted by the racist Mexican power elite. And this is an insight that perhaps, as someone with family in South America, I have cousins in Spain as well, that most Americans don't have. They're under the impression that Mexico is this monolithic society. It's not. The ruling elite of Mexico is, and has always been, European. And they view the poor and destitute not as fellow citizens, but as backward Aztecs. And they love it when these poor people, what they see as their Indians, leave Mexico and go to the United States to be paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. Here, for instance, is a white Mexican. And these are Mexicans who are ignored by their government largely for the crime of being descendants of the Aboriginal peoples of America. White Mexican. Aztec Mexican. People who look like this in Mexico have very little social obligation, a sense of social obligation to people who look like this. Okay, now, so what hitherto in our media have been called the browning of America is actually the reddening of America. These are largely Aboriginal people. The Mexican power elite is, for the most part, correct about that. For instance, here's an article in a genetic journal entitled Mexican Women's Mitochondrial DNA Primarily Native American. So these are people largely drawn from the Aboriginal repositories inside Mexico and Central America, and they are coming north. So, that's an angle that should be exploited by those activists, that they're not actually Hispanics per se, but they're, Native Americans really. Who've been forced to speak Spanish. There's a certain cognitive dissonance among most Americans. They understand, for instance, that Eddie Murphy is not Irish, despite having an Irish surname. But they kind of don't understand that concept when it comes to other cultures as well. For instance, they can see Chief Terry Gibson, who's in the U.S. Southwest, a tribal leader there, and they know, okay, well, he's an American Indian, and he's got a Scottish surname, without being Scottish, and they don't make that connection with Central and South America. In the 1500s, the Catholic Church had a Christianization process, and that same culturalization process was also afoot in what is now the United States and Canada. In Canada, for instance, their Indians were forced to take French names and speak French. In the United States, as Chief Terry Gibson provides an example, they were forced to speak English and take names from the British Isles. And in Mexico, Mexican Indians were forced to adopt Spanish surnames. For instance, the famous Indian brave Geronimo, he was actually Aboriginal. His name was Guayale, and then when Spanish missionaries came in, they encouraged the indigenous people to adopt what they saw as suitable names, which meant Western European names. So Guayale became Jerónimo. Jerónimo is the Spanish version of Jerome. So from Guayale, he became Geronimo Sanchez overnight, without any connection ethnologically whatsoever to Spain. Another example of this, in addition, would be Mexican President Benito Juarez. He was 100% Zapotec Indian, but he has the surname Juarez. How? Without being related to anybody named Juarez in Spain, the Catholic Church basically gave his family a list of surnames to choose from, and they could just as easily have been Torres or Gonzalez or Ruiz, but they chose Juarez from the list, and hence they became Benito Juarez. And this created strange demographic situations. On the U.S. border, for instance, you would have one family within a 2-mile radius, and that family would be named Smith. 2 miles over the border, the same family, same DNA, same background would be Sanchez, as an example. So what we're seeing now is not the browning of America, but the reddening of America in large part, as these Aboriginal peoples flood north. And it's related to the fact, ironically enough, that America is in the red economically. The media hardly ever provides this context. And I can't remember what intellectual said it, but he said that the removal of context is the essence of propaganda. So I'm going to try to, so far as I can, provide some context. As everybody knows, the United States is hemorrhaging economically, fiscally, financially. The 2008 banker bailout happened, which was precipitated by the real estate bubble. And what we're seeing now is a reaction to that, essentially. For instance, we're $17 trillion in debt. And that doesn't even count unfunded liabilities like Social Security, Medicare, the new Affordable Care Act. All these things are basically costing money. And we're on the precipice, as I said, of a meltdown, an economic meltdown, with the retirement of the baby boomers. The baby boomers, for those of you who don't know, it's the single largest generation born after World War II, from the years, I believe, 1945 to 1960. They constitute about 70 million Americans. We're about a nation of 300 million Americans. So 70 million out of 300 million, what is that, 1 in 4, are about to retire. In the past, we had 30 to 40 people working for every one person drawing on an entitlement program. So we were in pretty good economic shape to be able to provide benefits and services to our retirees, and that was good. But then a conundrum sets in, because all subsequent generations to the baby boomers are smaller, significantly smaller, where that generation might have 5 kids in a family, 7 kids in a family. Subsequent generations have 1 kid in the family, 2 kids in the family. So it leaves us in sort of a demographic nightmare, where we're going to have more people on entitlements than working, more people drawing benefits than are actually generating money. And so, in the smoky backrooms of Washington, D.C., you can imagine someone taking the decision to make up this shortfall by inviting massive amounts, tens of millions of people, to become a new tax base. This is the real reason, in my opinion, for the normalization of the foreign nationals who are coming here now illegally. So you see this, you see certain inklings of this. For instance, when the president ordered Homeland Security to allow the foreign nationals in during the current border crisis, he started putting them in Section 8 housing. Now, what does this have to do with our economy? Well, it's suggestive, because when the economy failed in 2008, largely based on the real estate bubble, It was as a result of realtors, real estate development companies, banks building millions and millions and millions of houses that then sat empty, that they took losses on. And a lot of these companies, they sell to the government through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And so they have an interest in filling those houses so that they can generate income. Because they do it by way of the government, however, it's the U.S. taxpayer paying for it. So when President Obama, whose largest single contributor was Goldman Sachs, the president of Wall Street, when President Obama started putting these immigrants in HUD housing and Section 8 housing, it solved a problem for these real estate development companies who had all these houses, all these units that were sitting fallow. Now they could generate income off them. The thing is, that income isn't coming out of thin air. It's coming from the American taxpayer. So it's a transfer of wealth from the working poor who pay the taxes to Wall Street. We see this in a number of different cases. I mean, the same thing happened in 2008 when they extracted money from the working class to be able to bail out Goldman Sachs and ING and all these other international conglomerates, corporations, investment banks. This seems to be the methodology. You transfer wealth from the tax farm, from the working poor, and you give it to Wall Street. The disastrous thing, however, is that if you want to offset the baby boomers, the smartest logical thing, okay, immigration, I get that, legal immigration. Legal immigrants can't even come unless they can prove that they are gainfully employed. They're usually sponsored by a corporation. They're not going to be a burden on the taxpayers. They have very low crime rates. They're your doctors, your engineers, your entrepreneurs from Asia, Europe, they're the entire world. When you pander to illegal immigration, contrary-wise, you get very unskilled people and people who tend to be dependent, people who draw on entitlement programs because, they're coming from intergenerational poverty in their own countries. And so when they come to the United States and there's this boon of free money, seemingly free money, that the U.S. taxpayer is actually paying for. And there's, different aspects to this as well as to why it's catastrophic in terms of cost. When you take on 1/3 of Mexico's working population, which is what the United States has essentially done, it creates stressors on infrastructure, because all these people are drinking water, all these people are flushing toilets, and as a result, you're seeing massive droughts especially in the western part of the country, and the water tables are shrinking, and people aren't making the connection. The media is not providing the context. When you take on the entire population of another country overnight, that's going to stress infrastructure. According to Forbes magazine, it's going to cost about $1 trillion in terms of roads, highways, water filtration plants, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of communities are talking about having to switch over to a third world standard. Currently, in the United States, we use different sources of water for our sewage and our toilets than we do for drinking. In Mexico, this isn't the case. In South America, this isn't the case. In most poor countries, they recycle the same water. And a lot of communities are talking about quietly doing this. So the very standard of living of the average American is going down. It's being Latin Americanized. And so those are the consequences, the profound cost and the loss in the standard of living. And, and thirdly, getting back to the earlier point of these being indigenous peoples, why it matters, in a sense, more than just the surface cost of people drawing on entitlement programs, on WIC and Medicaid, and going to hospitals and bankrupting them because they're going to the emergency rooms without health care. More than that, unfortunately, it's vulgar to even mention it, and it makes me uncomfortable, and I'm sure it makes you uncomfortable listening to it, but indigenous peoples, the largest single reason for their deaths from the 16th century to the 19th century was disease. Because indigenous people don't have immunities to Western European diseases, so you would see, tens of millions of them dying from cholera and typhus and polio, smallpox, leprosy. And right now, we're seeing an explosion of those very diseases on our southern border. And so it becomes a healthcare crisis. The Centers for Disease Control, we're talking about the sheer cost of having to deal with that. In the past, we accounted for that by quarantining people, and that happened as a result of Typhoid Mary. She was an Irish immigrant who was a food service worker. She infected hundreds of people, and those hundreds of people went on to infect thousands of people, and many, many, many individuals died. As a result of that, we instituted protocols that when immigrants came through, we gave them health screenings, and the disease rates in the United States plummeted. We became a first world country. And now those protocols, unfortunately, are being undermined, and Wall Street is encouraging the government to dispense with them. And as a result, we're seeing explosions in diseases that we had previously banished. Whooping cough, cholera, typhus, Chagas is now coming over, and now we're getting reports from Ebola coming from Africa. So it's not simply, a Mexican issue. It's not simply an African issue. It's not simply an Irish issue, regarding, Typhoid Mary. It's an issue of first world versus third world. What standards we want as a society. Can we afford to take the hit of the retirement of the baby boomers, and then over top of it, to throw 50 million more people from the third world on top of that already crippling, crushing debt on the future generation? And the answer, when you look at the numbers resoundingly, is no. And at the back of it, as I said, it's always portrayed as altruism. Oh, well, you have to do this. You're doing this for... But it's not. I mean, look at Wall Street having President Obama put them in HUD housing that they coincidentally own. It's a transfer of wealth from the working poor. They're squeezing the last drops of money before the economy collapses. And you see this especially, as I said, just getting back to the America being in the red. We're $200 trillion in debt when you include unfunded liabilities. So the rich are having trouble knowing where to put their money. Historically the stock market or bonds, but the Fed is keeping the bond rate at 1%. So they're actually losing money if they get bonds, because that's lower than the rate of inflation. The stock market is too shaky. So what the rich have increasingly been doing is reposing their funds, their investments in real estate. And whenever the economy is about to get bad, they start using real assets, gold, silver, food. They'll invest in real estate and land. So that's what's happening. So with this investment in real estate and all these empty units, well, there's a quick and easy solution. Just, stick them with foreign nationals, with millions and millions, tens of millions of foreign nationals, and that's good for Wall Street. That's crippling for the local communities who are expected to take on those people. For instance, the average American child costs $17,000 to go to school per kid per year. So when foreign nationals come and they work under the table and they don't pay property taxes, the local community is left with that $17,000 per child, and that says nothing of the free lunches that they're being signed up for, or the English as a second language programs that are taking funds that used to be for gym or used to be for extracurricular activities, used to be for teaching Latin or German or Italian, and those programs are being cut. Once again, the standard for the entire community goes down because they have to absorb the costs. In summation, I'd like to close with an observation by H.G. Wells. He said that one of the most pernicious innovations of the modern age was the concept of stock ownership in the corporation. In the age of feudalism, contrary-wise, the barons could only abuse the land so long before it hurt their own interests. They could only starve their serfs for so long before it would actually affect them. So they had to learn some measure of restraint. With the advent of stock ownership and the corporation, you have diluted responsibility by people who never have to set eyes on the communities that they're affecting. They can vote to gut an entire sector and take a once prosperous area and turn it into a smoking crater if it makes their dividend go up a nickel. Because of this, corporations are inherently sociopathic, destructive. They have no guiding intelligence. And for this reason, I'm against Wall Street's collusion with Washington vis-a-vis illegal immigration. It's short-term gains for long-term destruction, for nothing less than the Latin Americanization of the U.S. economy. And the people who it's going to disproportionately hurt the worst are the young, because they're already saddled with the baby boomers. And they're seeing their wages go down as a result of rising taxes to pay for the entitlements. So they already have the baby boomers, so throw 50 million third world people on top of that, and it's crippling. News reports currently are saying that for the first time in U.S. history, the current generation will have a lower standard of living than their parents. This is unprecedented. And for this reason, I am against illegal immigration. I don't want the United States to look like other third world countries. I've been to South America. I've been to developing nations, and I've seen the crushed glass on the walls outside homes. I've seen the bars on windows. And this is what happens when you have a two-tiered society, a racially stratified society with incredible income inequality. And I don't fancy living in an America like that, but that is the America that is going to be inherited by my children and my children's children. So for those politicians in Washington claiming to be speaking on my behalf, to those ideologues who are arrogating the authority to tell people how I'm supposed to feel, fuck you.